Huh?
It's 5:04 and welcome into a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We do start with some breaking news this morning on the race for North Carolina's Supreme Court. That, of course, the race between Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs. Late last night, a federal judge decided to send the case back to the North Carolina Supreme Court. This was originally levied by Jefferson Griffin, the Republican candidate. U.S. Chief District Judge and Richard Myers' order arrived just 4 days before the State Board of Elections is scheduled to certify Democrat Allison Riggs as the winner of the November the 5th election. The State Board of Elections did appeal the ruling Monday night, so they have already put in their appeal for that. Riggs currently leads Griffin by 734 votes out of 5.5 million cast in the race. Griffin, who currently serves on the North Carolina Court of Appeals, is challenging more than 60,000 ballots cast statewide. This complaint goes back to December the 18th. He did originally file with the state Supreme Court. That case was moved to federal court the next day. Myers, writing in his 27-page order last night, quote, "In this removed state action, a sitting state court judge seeks a writ of prohibition, which is a form of judicial relief authorized by a state constitution, from the state Supreme Court that would enjoin the State Board of Elections from counting votes for a state election contest that were cast by voters in a manner allegedly inconsistent with state law." Myers continued by saying, "Should a federal tribunal resolve such a dispute?" He put a question mark there. "This court, with due regard for state sovereignty and the independence of states to decide matters of substantial public concern, thinks not." Myers said, however, he abstains from deciding Griffin's motion and remands this matter to North Carolina's Supreme Court. The election board had argued that a federal judge should address the case because it deals with the federal Help America Vote Act, HAVA as it's known. That's from 2002. Myers wrote, "The state board asserts that Griffin's challenge to voter registration would require this court to construe HAVA, but that is incorrect. After Congress passed HAVA, North Carolina's General Assembly enacted parallel legislation establishing a uniform system of registration for both state and federal elections. But that uniform system does not eliminate the legal distinction between federal elections, which Congress may regulate, and state elections, which Congress, with limited exceptions, may not. And this matter involves a state election, so HAVA, even if practically relevant, is legally irrelevant." Myers continued by saying, "The people of North Carolina have chosen to implement a uniform system for both state and federal election registration, but that legislative choice itself, a creation of state law, does not transform state law issues with state elections into federal questions for federal courts merely because resolution of state law issues, by implication, could also inform litigants in the context of federal elections." He said, "In sum, the court finds that none of the three challenges in Griffin's petition necessarily raise an issue of federal law, and his request for declaration rejecting the state board's federal law arguments is simply an anticipatory effort at rebutting predictable federal defenses. Therefore, Griffin's petition does not arise under the laws of the United States. This court would not have had original jurisdiction over it, and removal was improper." So boiling all of that down this morning, the case between Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs, which really is over about 60,000 votes in the state, is now making its way to the state's highest court, which I will note is controlled by Republicans. We are under a very, very tight timeline with this. The State Board of Elections is set to likely certify this election on Friday. That's the 10th. We expect, and I think it's safe to assume that we could see some additional action on this today. whether that be from an immediate request from the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, where this could be appealed, some shotgun action by the North Carolina Supreme Court. This is a very fluid story. We're keeping a very close eye on it. We'll get the latest details with Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation coming up tomorrow morning. We'll be tracking that all throughout the day over on our website, carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:09, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. So many years removed from COVID-19, COVID lockdowns, and the impacts all across our lives, we are still talking about that in regards to education. To get some more details on how that's playing out here in North Carolina, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning, syndicated columnist John Hood. John, as we sit here a couple days into 2025, I can't believe we're still talking about COVID and lockdowns, but you've got an interesting piece up this morning over at carolinajournal.com. What are those details looking like?
Well, Nick, we're going to be talking about the effects of COVID for many, many more years to come, because one of the long-term effects that isn't so much about medical care and the illness itself is about the closure of schools. North Carolina kept its schools closed longer than many of the other states in our region, places like Florida, places that are neighboring states. And the argument was that we're trying to keep people safe, particularly children, which wasn't a very good argument since the risk to young people from COVID was very small. But the more serious argument was that it was an attempt to preserve the health of teachers and people who might catch the virus from teachers, that sort of thing. Still wasn't a very good argument, but it was a better argument. Weighing against that was the very obvious risk that if you kept schools closed for more than a few weeks, maybe a few months, that the damage to the academic achievement, to what students need to be learning, reading, mathematics, other subjects, and also social cues and learning how to interact with other people, that kind of damage would be deep and it would be lasting. Well, there's still a debate about how deep the damage is and whether it will last for the entire duration of the COVID generation school careers, but there is no debate that it had a negative effect. You can see that in recent studies, including an Urban Institute analysis of National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP scores. The NAEP is the best set of exams we have to track the performance of American school children over time. NAEP, which is a federal program, they administer this test every couple of years or so to a representative sample in every state. And so you can really see how North Carolina tracks with other states. Until 2019, the story in North Carolina had been, since the introduction of these tests, really, that North Carolina had been improving significantly. That kind of leveled off in the 2010s, but we still had it by 2019. If you average across all four of the exams, fourth and eighth grade, math and reading, and you adjust for student background, which you need to do in order to try to evaluate the effect of schools themselves, North Carolina was ranked 7th in the country in test score. We shouldn't have been settling for that because lots of states in the union don't have very good schools, but we were comparatively well off in terms of public school outcomes. In 2022, NAEP administered the first post-COVID or during COVID tests. North Carolina tumbled from 7th to 29th.
Wow.
In terms of the actual scores, there was a 10-point drop in the math scores for 8th graders in North Carolina, 7-point drop. These are not tiny drops. These are statistically significant drops. And the concern is that was the consequence of North Carolina under former Governor Roy Cooper keeping the schools closed much longer than in other places. For example, Florida and Texas still have top 10 ranked school systems like North Carolina used to have in 2019. They still have those today. They didn't have the long school closures. North Carolina did. Now, I don't want to jump to too many conclusions here because there could be other factors in play, but I do think more careful studies suggest that there is at least a modest negative effect of keeping schools closed longer. Some studies show a major negative effect of keeping schools closed longer. So I think North Carolina, again, under the former administration, the Cooper administration, made a significant error in keeping our schools closed so long. And we just have to hope that our schools, our teachers, our parents, our kids can try to recover effectively from that. Perhaps the 2024 NAEP scores will show a bit of of a bounce back? I certainly hope so.
We'll continue the conversation with syndicated columnist John Hood coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for a look at traffic on this Tuesday morning with Dave Hewitt.
Hey, good morning. We're getting a cold.
your emergency situation station.
It's 5:19. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. If you miss any portion of the program, we encourage you to check out the podcast of the show. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour, tap that subscribe and follow button, and you'll get a new show delivered to your smartphone each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. To download and subscribe now. Recapping our breaking news story this morning, a federal judge in Richard Myers has decided to send Republican State Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin's election complaint back to the North Carolina Supreme Court. With that, overnight, the North Carolina State Board of Elections has appealed this to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. However, we talked about this very tight timeline. The Fourth Circuit is closed today due to inclement weather in Washington, D.C. They were closed yesterday and today. That could have some impacts as they are closed and not handling any action as of today. We will, again, continue to keep a very close eye on this story throughout the day, and we'll have additional details throughout the day as they break over on our website, carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:21. Continuing our discussion this morning with syndicated columnist John Hood and his piece over at carolinajournal.com this morning. John, talking about the recovery and relief efforts is specifically dealing with these children in the K through 12 public education system on how old the student was or what grade they were in K through 12 when this happened. If you look at 7th or 8th graders that were in 7th or 8th grade or going into those grades when those lockdowns started, John, you've only got now 2 additional years with those students before you ship them off to college. If they're not at the level that their predecessors were prior to COVID-19, is it fair to say then maybe you have to start adjusting things on the collegiate level to adapt to these children that, I guess, across the board are all dealing with some sort of this learning loss? There could be a huge effect here, not just in K through 12.
Well, there could be. I mean, one possible explanation or reaction to what you said is, well, maybe most of the learning loss is concentrated among the lowest performing students who are unlikely to attend college anyway. So it's going to hurt them to not be performing as well, but it doesn't necessarily affect what colleges will have to do later, because not a high percentage of those students were likely to end up at least at a 4-year university. That's not the story though, Nick, because when I looked at advanced students who had tested advanced, we had fewer of those in 2022 than in 2019, significantly fewer. The percentage who were proficient, which is sort of in between an advanced student and a basic level student, proficiency is also down. So this learning loss effect didn't just affect kids who are at the bottom end of academics. They were already behind and COVID put them further behind. That happened. But it also affected the performance of students in the middle of the distribution and even our advanced students. Now, you're right. We've got more time to try to help our younger students recover. The 4th grade scores were also weak, but it is possible they will bounce back. We should certainly pray that all of this reverses itself. But I'm afraid what we're going to have is, you're right, some students who end up going to college whose learning losses during COVID were never fully regained, never fully offset, and they're going to struggle a bit. And we're also going to have some kids who weren't necessarily going to go to university. Maybe they were on the cusp. Now they're not going to. And we've got to figure out effective ways to improve their math and reading skills so they can perform well in the working world and really just as citizens of our country. That's one of the main reasons we educate kids. It's not just so they'll have jobs. It's so they can be citizens, so they can shoulder responsibilities as voters, as parents, as members of a community. And the learning losses are severe. That is why we should have taken a much closer look back in 2020 and 2021, when other states and much of the developed world was sending their kids back to school and North Carolina did not. Now, again, I think that was I don't want to question the motives of the people who made this decision, because I think they meant well, but they made a bad call, and we should learn from that and be much more careful in the future about just saying, well, I mean, students can just learn from home. There are lots of ways you can impart information over the internet. There are some distance learning programs that work, but slapping something together during an emergency was never going to work, and in fact, it did not.
Well, I mean, a great example of this is you and I are talking virtually this morning as we have this discussion. John, we're both adults. We don't need to learn social cues. We're able to interact with each other. You throw a third grader in front of a Zoom call, that's a completely different ball game in what we're talking about.
Indeed, and also you and I are engaged in a one-on-one conversation, and if I don't answer your questions, this is going to go very poorly. But if you're teaching a group of kids and they're all on a screen, I actually did a little bit of this. On the side, I teach dancing. And for at least a few weeks, we had to convert our classes from in-person classes to Zoom classes. You could just imagine how challenging it was to try to teach tap dancing over Zoom. But any kind of teacher dealing with even a dozen students, okay, some of them are going to zoom out. You can't really keep up with them as well. Their attention tends to wander. They're much more easily distracted. Even the best teachers doing their level best to do something valuable with distance learning, you're going to lose some attention. It's just not as effective for most students. Again, there are exceptions. There's certain kinds of things, well-designed online modules that take kids through certain videos or through certain diagrams and test them. That's not what was happening. What was happening was an attempt to lecture or lead conversations or do worksheets over Zoom. It was not well thought out. Again, I'm not questioning the intentions of the people involved. They never anticipated trying to deliver for a whole year or longer public education to grade schoolers. That just wasn't what anyone had anticipated doing. And it showed. It didn't work. And we should learn that lesson, not just about schooling, but when you have a real risk, COVID was a real risk, and you're trying to balance that against the cost of mitigating that risk, don't downplay those costs. The educational costs, separate from the economics and people's jobs and all the things that happened to businesses during COVID, but the educational losses from those lengthy school shutdowns are massive, and they simply were not even remotely justified by the scant benefits.
So, John, as we turn the page on this, focusing on some of those younger students that we have more time with in that K through 12 public education system, what can we do for those individuals that may have been going into first, second grade back when this lockdown, they're now fourth or fifth graders? Do we have time to try and help them recover and get them up to what a standard, middle or high schooler would be as they progress through the education system?
Well, I want to be careful to say I might be called an expert at how to teach tap dancing, but not necessarily how to teach arithmetic. But what I've understood, the studies that I've read, the true experts that I've consulted, the magic word that you already mentioned is time. Some of what will be needed is additional time, tutoring time, in-depth time with small groups or individual students to get them caught up. We're also North Carolina at least has started to revolutionize the teaching of reading and I think soon mathematics. And those improved ways of teaching in case of reading, getting young people familiar with phonics and basic structures of language, we are probably going to see some recovery in the 2024 NAEP scores and beyond. And I just hope that we can do it fast enough so that the lasting effects on students when they become adults is maybe moderated. I don't think it'll be entirely offset, but significantly moderated would be a good outcome at this point.
John, it's some great insight this morning. Where can folks read more and check out all of your work?
Well, my column runs in a lot of newspapers, but you can always read it first at carolinajournal.com.
John Hood joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 528, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at traffic this morning. We'll get an update from Dave Hewitt.
It's a cold start out.
Good morning again. It's 5:36. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Taking a look at some other stories that we are tracking statewide this morning. A city in North Carolina has the top inbound migration, according to United Van Lines mover studies, which was released back a few days ago. And it is Wilmington. That is the top metro area across the nation where people move to in 2024. North Carolina ranks in the top 5 states for inbound migration in the same study. Wilmington saw a whopping 83% inbound migration, according to the study, making it the fastest growing metropolitan statistical area in 2024. Wilmington beat out their neighbor in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, which came in 3rd place with 80% inbound migration. Several studies have also ranked North Carolina among the top 5 states for inbound migration. The study referenced above ranks North Carolina at number 5, beaten out by South Carolina at 3, and West Virginia taking the top spot. Some other North Carolina areas also coming in the study. Hickory, North Carolina came in at number 9 among top inbound migration with 75%. Greenville, North Carolina coming in as well at 74%. And the only other North Carolina metropolitan area is Greensboro, Winston-Salem with 65% move-in. There's also some South Carolina areas in there. We talked about Myrtle Beach. Also listed in there is the Greenville, Spartanburg area. So major move-ins to North and South Carolina. According to Ellie Cummings, who is the Vice President of Corporate Communications at United Van Lines, she says the annual study highlights how economic disruptions, including inflation and nationwide housing affordability crises, are reshaping where and why Americans choose to move. Movers are discovering that there are numerous cities and regions where they can achieve both economic relief and a rich, rewarding life experience. According to data from the report of those moving to North Carolina, 20% did so for retirement. North Carolina also ranked number 7 amongst top states to move for retirees, beating out South Carolina, which came in at number 3, Delaware taking the top spot there. United Van Lines has been tracking migration patterns since 1977. This is their 48th annual study, so they've obviously got this very much in the bag in regards to how to conduct this. And according to the U-Haul Growth States out of their 2024 report, which was also released just a few days ago, North Carolina is ranked number 3, slightly higher than previous studies, beating out sister state South Carolina, which takes the top spot. Florida comes in at 4, Tennessee at number 5, according to U-Haul. So major inbound migration to some North Carolina areas: Wilmington, Hickory, and Greensboro, Winston-Salem. You can read more on this story and check out the entire list of all of the top 25 move-in and move-out areas across the nation by visiting our website this morning, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:39. We are about 10 months into legalized sports betting across the state of North Carolina. One of the revenue sources for sports betting, and one of the ways in which it is justified, is that it is funding the university system in terms of their athletic events at a major level. To get some more details on that this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, Katie Zender. Katie, sports betting was controversial when it passed March of last year, but it's in effect now. It's been in effect. And there's some major dollars being doled out to systems across the state.
Right. Good morning, Nick. Happy New Year. It's so good to be back. Yes. So, sports betting has been doing very, very well. Between March and November of 2024, a total of $98.6 million in total tax revenue has been collected, and 17.3% of that goes to North Carolina public universities. So there's 13 state universities across the UNC system that receive this funding. They receive 20% of the total tax revenue, as is set up by the general statutes. 50% of the tax revenue goes into the general fund, and that's broken down. I did a report on this a couple of months ago. North Carolina has the 11th highest tax rate on sport betting, taxed at 18%. So that revenue, that $98.6 million that they acquired between March and in November of 2024, 50% of that goes into the general fund, and that's broken up in different ways. 20% goes into the university system and is spread across the 13 UNC universities.
Can you go through the list of those 13 universities for our listeners, and how much money are they actually getting in regards to the story that you're tracking this morning?
Right. So between April and September of 2024, 1.32 million was transferred to each of the 13 UNC system institutions. And those institutions are Appalachian State University, East Carolina, Elizabeth City State University, Fayetteville State, North Carolina A&T State University, North Carolina Central University, UNC Asheville, UNC Charlotte, UNC Greensboro, UNC Pembroke, UNC Wilmington, Western Carolina University, and Winston-Salem State University.
So obviously a lot of major institutions that folks are familiar with across the UNC system here. Now, Katie, is this a one-time thing, or is this going to be, as sports betting continues in the state, this money will continue to roll into these various universities? And from what I remember about this legislation when it passed, it's specifically tailored towards athletic events that are taking place at those universities.
Right, exactly, Nick. So this is going to be something that's ongoing. These universities are going to be getting that 20% of whatever tax revenue is collected. So in fiscal year 2024, which ended back in June, athletic departments received over 800,000 when they were only expecting about 300,000. So the sports betting is really doing much better than anticipated. Projections for fiscal year 2025, which will end this June, are projected at over $2 million.
Yeah, so you're talking about a substantial amount of money being injected into some of these schools. However, Katie, it's important to note there's still a lot of detractors on sports betting, like there is many other things in the state. They don't believe it's something that the state government should be involved in. However, it is. The state government is now fully invested in it. It'll be a year anniversary coming up in March. This looks like it's not even for the university systems, but for the state as a whole. This is a pretty substantial revenue generator.
Exactly, Nick. This is producing huge amounts of tax revenue. Like I said, 50% of the revenue goes into the general fund, and that's split up in different ways. In fact, sports betting has been doing so well that the NC Lottery Commission actually approved back in September the requirements and provided guidance to licensed interactive sports wagering operators so that they could move forward with sports retail betting, which basically allows certain wagering operators to allow in-person sports betting. So the commission has issued a memorandum which outlines the steps that an operator can take to obtain a, quote, place of public accommodation and certification of compliance. This has to be obtained from the commission before operating a facility of this kind. This is according to Ryan Carter. He's the PIO for the NC Lottery Commission, and I spoke with him last week. Under current law, in-person sports betting is legal, and operators have been provided with the straightforward process for opening such facilities. And the commission has also adopted the rules for wagering facilities and in-person betting, sports betting, to protect the public. So, that's a step that has been taken because online sports betting has been doing so well. They're now taking the next step.
Yeah, and it would obviously be some of these select venues. There's a handful of them that they said would fall under this classification, where you'd have essentially kiosks where you would be able to go up and physically place that bet in person, and maybe we'll see some of that come online this year. Katie, let me ask you this as we wrap up this morning. Do you suspect or have you heard any chatter as to, is the General Assembly going to touch anything related to sports betting as we head into the new legislative session? Any tweaks? Anything that we've heard from that, or is this system just going to continue to chug along in the successful fashion that it has over the last 9 months or so?
You know what, Nick, we haven't really heard too much about anything related to what the General Assembly is going to do on that. So, yeah, I don't know if they're going to take a look at, in-person sports betting. I haven't heard anything on that yet, but we'll definitely be keeping our ear to the ground and, watching what they're going to be doing, as they come back into session here in the next couple of weeks. And, if listeners and readers want to take a more in-depth look at what's actually being done with this money, there's a few examples in the article of what some of the specific schools are doing with this revenue.
You can, of course, read those details by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. Katie Zender joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 545, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at traffic this morning. We'll get an update from Dave Hewitt.
Cold start out there, but the road.
551 News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Good Tuesday morning to you. You are listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. I'm Nick Craig. We continue to track our breaking story this morning, which surrounds the race for North Carolina Supreme Court. A federal judge decided last night to send Republican State Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin's election complaint back to North Carolina's highest court. U.S. Chief Judge, District Judge Richard Myers ordered that case back to the state court just 4 days before the State Board of Election is scheduled to certify Democrat Allison Riggs as the winner of the November the 5th elections. I'll note that the State Board of Elections did appeal that ruling Monday night around 10 o'clock or so last night. They appealed that to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, which is out of Richmond, Virginia. However, they are closed today due to inclement weather. They were also closed yesterday, so that could complicate the timeline here as well. Riggs currently leads Griffin by 734 votes out of 5.5 million ballots cast in the election. Griffin is challenging more than 60,000 ballots that were cast statewide. He filed a complaint on December the 18th with the state Supreme Court against the state election boards. Then the election board moved that to the federal court under the jurisdiction of Chief District Judge Richard Myers the following day. In his 27-page order yesterday, Myers said, "In this removed state action, a sitting state court judge seeks a form of judicial relief authorized by the state constitution from the state Supreme Court that would enjoin the State Board of Elections from counting the votes for a state election contest that were cast by voters in a manner allegedly inconsistent with state law." He then asked this question, this being Richard Myers: "Should a federal tribunal resolve such a dispute? This court, with due regard for state sovereignty and the independence of states to decide matters of substantial public concern, thinks not." Myers abstained from deciding Griffin's motion and decided to send this matter to the highest court in the state. The election board had argued that a federal judge should address the case because it deals with the Help America Vote Act of 2002, HAVA, as you've probably heard it described, HAVA. The state board asserts that Griffin's challenge to voter registration would require this court to construe HAVA, but that is incorrect, according to Myers. He says after Congress passed HAVA, the North Carolina General Assembly enacted parallel legislation establishing a uniform system of registration for both state and federal elections. But that uniform system does not eliminate the legal distinction between federal elections, which Congress may regulate, and state elections, which Congress, with very limited exceptions, may not. And this matter involves a state election, so HAVA, even if practically irrelevant, is legally irrelevant. Myers said that the people of North Carolina have chosen to implement a uniform system for both state and federal election registration, but that legislative choice itself, a creation of state law, does not transform state law issues with state elections into federal questions for federal courts merely because resolution of state law issues. By implication, could also inform litigation in the context of federal elections. He wrapped up by saying, in sum, the court finds that none of the three challenges in Griffin's protest necessarily raise any issues of federal law, and his request for declaring rejection to the state board's federal law arguments is simply an anticipatory effort at rebutting the federal defenses. Therefore, Griffin's petition does not arise under the law of the United States. This court would not have had original jurisdiction over it, and removal was improper. That meaning the removal from the state's highest court, the North Carolina Supreme Court, to federal court. Myers cited multiple reasons for his decision to abstain from hearing the case. His first, the issue raised in Griffin's protest reflects unsettled questions of state constitutionality and statutory law and bear directly on North Carolina's right to self-govern. Number 2 said that there is an existing dispute resolution process designed by state law, which a federal court should hesitate to disrupt. And number 3, Griffin's claims are prudently under state law. And 4, the federal interest in this case is tumultuous, and a state tribunal is the component and the avenue to protect federal constitutional rights. Taken together, those factors counsel in favor of Myers leaving this case back to the state's highest court. He finished out by saying, if our system of federalism is to exist in more than name only, it means that this court should abstain in this case under these circumstances. So where do we go from here in this very short timeline over the next couple of days? Well, the case is now squarely back under the North Carolina Supreme Court, which does have a 7-2 GOP majority. So they could take up some action on this in the next couple of days. As I mentioned, the State Board of Elections has already put forward an emergency appeal to the Fourth Circuit, U.S. Fourth Circuit Court in Virginia. That's where the Fourth Circuit operates. And with that, we will see if they decide to take something up. All we know for certain this morning is that by Friday, the North Carolina State Board of Elections is likely to certify this election and give that victory to Allison Riggs. So the question will be, does either a state or federal court step in the next couple of days to provide some sort of relief for Griffin, or on the other side for Riggs? We will get and be tracking that latest news throughout the day today. We'll chat with Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation coming up tomorrow morning. That's going to do it for a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. We are back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on WBT.